Hello, my holy sisters and brothers. Great to see you today. How's it going? In the house with us, Yehudit Sobel says shalom from Florence, South Carolina. Paula Schmidt-Klauser is in the house from Chicago. Melissa Eitel-Jurin, good evening from Great Neck, New York. Bill Eldridge says hello from Berkeley. Bryna Bloomfield from Cambridge, Mass. Lucy Ram Johnson, shalom from Minnesota. James Roth, shalom from Indianapolis. Tom Beck says Lila Tove from Philadelphia. John Shore in the house from Sedona. Lynn Job from North Texas. Neil is in the house from Virginia. Diane Yaris still hates the timer. And it's great to see you all. Claudia Steiner's with us from Brazil. Rochelle Rosen from Modesto. Robin Stewart from Ohio. And Roland Forson says hello from Zhuzhou. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. In China. How awesome. We are transcontinental. Intercontinental. Okay. So we've got a really interesting daf ahead of us today. Let us light up the darkness. All right. Terrific. We are holding on daf Kuf Tes Zion, that's page 116, page 116 of Tractate Shabbos, the second volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 16. Today, with God's help, we're going to wrap up our discussion of the first Mishna of the chapter and get into the second Mishna. This whole chapter, chapter 16, is about what happens if a fire breaks out on Shabbos. And as we mentioned yesterday, you would think you would get into the basic principle, which is so counter-instinctual, that, once you've secured life is, of course, the most important thing. You desecrate Shabbos, you do whatever you need to do to save a life. But if lives are not in danger, if it's just a small fire that if it spreads, could really destroy property, then you still can't extinguish a fire. That's the main principle. And you can't carry things to violate Shabbos just to save stuff. That's the main principle. But the sages don't begin there. They begin with the exception to the rule. That's what Mishnah number 1 has been about, that we save holy books. We save sacred books from a fire, lest God's name be desecrated, because the divine names that are printed in a Torah scroll, for example, would be destroyed in the fire. And as we learned yesterday, when we're evaluating whether a book needs to be saved or not, and here the case is an old scroll, right? And remember, when we're talking about books in Talmudic times, the principles are going to get brought forward to today. When a book looks like a book, when a holy book looks like a holy book, what we call a book. The technical term for this is a codex. Books, the general word books, sephorim, in ancient times did not refer to books with bindings and pages, but rather to scrolls, right? These days, really the only place where we see a scroll is a Torah scroll, in a synagogue, not too many other places. But back then, all books had that format. So when we're talking about saving books from a fire, you have to think we're talking about scrolls, right? Long parchment scrolls rolled up on some kind of a rod or a double rod. Okay, and an old scroll, one where the writing has worn away, well, if the writing has worn away enough, then it's no longer going to be a scroll. And as we discussed yesterday, at what point, has it gone too far? And the answer was, if it has God's names, clearly legible names of God in it, so then we would save it if it's a Jewish holy book. And even if God's name is not in it, but there are 85 letters still legible, arranged in words, not just a letter here and there, but enough words so that 85 letters are legible, then it would still have that status of a holy book. And where do we get that number, 85 letters? as we mentioned yesterday, it's that passage in the book of Numbers, chapter 10, verses 35 and 36, which is separated from the rest of the text around it by an upside down Hebrew letter nun before it and another upside down Hebrew letter nun after it, somehow just set apart from the rest of the book. And on today's daf, we just mentioned fairly quickly what it is about that passage that is so special, that it's set apart from the Torah in the original text. And our sages consider that this short passage, just 2 verses, actually constitutes its own book. And so, in fact, when you count this way, there's not 5 books of Moses in the Torah, there are 7, right? So Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus. Then we get to the book of Numbers. What comes before that passage is a book. That passage is a book. And what comes after it is another book. And then Deuteronomy is the 7th book. I read it to you yesterday. Basically, these are the words which we say all the time in synagogue whenever there's a Torah service, every Shabbos and Mondays and Thursdays as well. What Moses would say when the Israelites were going to break camp, right? So they were in an encampment in the wilderness, and when it was time to break camp and move to a new location, which would be indicated by God, God would give the signal because his presence in the form of a pillar of cloud would rise and move forward to the next location where the 2 million Israelites, the children of Israel wandering in the desert, their next location for an encampment. So God would God's manifestation, obviously God, we're in God. God is greater than this universe, but the manifestation that God had sent to show that God's presence was there, it would move forward. And so Moses would say, arise. Let me see, what are the exact words? Did I keep the bookmark on it? No, I did not. But luckily we know the number. 10, 35, and 36, right? Yeah. Here it is. 10, 35, and 36. When the ark would journey, Moses said, arise, Hashem, and let your foes be scattered. Let those who hate you flee from before you. And when it rested, he would say, reside tranquilly, O Hashem, among the myriad thousands of Israel. And so we'll actually use that at the beginning of the Torah service and at the end of the Torah service. But here's the point. We get the comment now that we're talking about this verse, sort of, okay, it's set apart by those upside down lettered nuns, but conceptually, why are these verses set apart and made so distinct from what comes before and what's after that we would consider it a separate book, that these 2 verses would be considered a separate book? So Shimon ben Gamliel says, in the future, this passage will be uprooted from here, and it will be placed in another place, another spot in the Torah. Why? Because chronologically it doesn't belong here. According to Shimon ben Gamliel, it belongs at the beginning of the book of Numbers when the array is described, right? That the 12 tribes of Israel would be arrayed around the encampment, around the tabernacle in the center of the encampment. And of course, in the center of the tabernacle would be the ark, the holy ark of the covenant. And then in that same area at the beginning of the book of Numbers, it's described that when it was time to move on, right, first the tribes in the east would go, and then I think then the tribes in the north, then the Levites carrying all of the equipment and the wagons and the ark itself and all the trappings, all the necessary vessels for service in the tabernacle, and then the other 6 tribes would come behind. And so when they would travel, that's where this verse about traveling would naturally belong. So then the question is, well, why was it moved over to here? Now, the Torah is not always chronological. Rashi points out several places, as we read the Torah and in our yearly cycle, we come to certain passages that Rashi says, as you can see, it's not chronological. The narrative skipped around a little bit for one reason or another. Here, says Shimon ben Gamliel, it was moved. Why? To separate two instances of the children of Israel transgressing and being punished, right? So rather than it seems like they're always transgressing and defying Moses and defying God and just being whiny complainers, at least let's have something beautiful between two of those events. And that's why it's out of place, and it's its own thing in the location where it sits in Numbers chapter 10, verses 35 and 36. Okay, we return to what objects we're going to rescue from a fire, right? So if we're rescuing these objects from a fire, it means that we're going to pick them up and carry them outside, right? Transferring them from the private domain to the public domain. In other words, we're going to desecrate Shabbos to save these objects from a fire. And so this Mishna is all about saving sacred books from a fire. So now the question is asked, well, what about the blank pages, the blank folios, the blank sheets in a Torah scroll? So if you ever looked at a Torah scroll, right, there's blank space at the top of each page, and there's blank space at the bottom, and there's going to be blank columns between books of the Torah, or between columns certainly, and there's going to be a somewhat sizable blank area at the beginning of the scroll and at the end of the scroll, because it's used to wrap around the dowel or the rod in the middle of the scroll, and at the end to wrap around the whole thing. If you've ever seen a Megillah that we read at Purim, unlike a Torah, which has two rods, right? It's a scroll arranged on two rods that we sort of roll back and forth from one rod to the other. A Megillah that we read at Purim it's much shorter, and so it's just the book of Esther, and it's on one rod in the middle. So there's some blank space for the page to wrap around the rod initially, and blank space at the end to wrap around the outside of the rolled scroll. So what about those blank pages? Do we save blank pages that were part or are part of a holy scroll if for some reason we can't save the whole scroll? So the Gemara takes this question and says, well, we already know the answer, right? We said that if there's less than 85 letters, like in the passage that we've been talking about, so then we don't save it. It doesn't qualify as a book. So why are you asking about blank pages? And then the answer is, well, the reason we're asking about it is because if you're talking about a scroll where over time the ink wore away, okay, so the reason it was holy is because of the holy writing. And now that the writing has worn away over time, it has lost its inherent holiness because it's no longer a holy book. But the blank areas, that in any holy book, there are blank areas. Those blank areas, they haven't changed. They're still doing the same job they were doing when the book was complete. So if for some reason we have blank pages that have been separated, do we save those? And then one answer is, well, when they're attached to the Holy Scroll, they're doing their job being the blank areas. But if you, for some reason, detach those blank sheets and now they're just blank sheets of parchment, why would we save them? That's where the discussion gets to. And rather than just give an answer, another source is brought down and from a Baraisa. All right, so a Baraisa is contemporaneous with a Mishna. The Baraisas are sugya teachings from the Tanaim, the sages of the Mishnaic period and before, but that for one reason or another, the editor of the Mishnah, Yehuda Hanasi, did not include in the Mishnah. There's still very important rulings, often authoritative, but for one reason or another, they didn't get into the Mishnah. But certainly, the Amoraim, the sages of the Talmudic period, right, of the Gemara, the next generation, several generations of sages that argue what does the Mishnah say, what does the Mishnah mean, they will often bring a Baraisa to give evidence one way or another on a particular ruling. And in this Baraisa that's being brought down now, we learn that blank folios and the sacred books of heretics we do not save from a fire. And this would imply that even though these are sacred books that have divine names of God in them, even in the Holy Tongue, even in Hebrew, because these books were composed by these heretics, we do not save those books, even though they have divine names of God in them, even in the Holy Tongue of Hebrew. So, we don't even, and in fact, we learn, we don't even save such books from a fire on a weekday, right? We've been talking about desecrating Shabbos in order to save, for example, a Torah scroll. We would save a Torah scroll from a fire as long as it was safe to do so. We weren't risking life in order to save the Torah. But obviously during the week, we wouldn't even think about it. We would rescue all of our sacred books. Of course we would. As we would on Shabbos. But when we're talking about the sacred books of heretics, that we don't save from a fire. We certainly don't desecrate Shabbos, and we don't even save them on a weekday from a fire, or from a flood, or from an earthquake, or from a landslide. These books are held in very low regard by our sages. Rabbi Tarfon says about these heretics, if I was on the run for my life, if I needed a place to hide, because I was running from a wild animal or because the Romans were persecuting me, trying to kill me, and I needed a place to hide, says Rabbi Tarfon, I would hide in a house of idolatry, which that's saying a lot because our sages would never walk into a house of idolatry on purpose. But to save his life, he would enter a house of idolatry, but he would not enter a house of the heretics. So he's using hyperbole perhaps, or maybe he really means it, to tell you just how low the regard of the sages toward the heretics is. In the Art Scroll, Talmud Bavli, the Hebrew word is minim. Okay, so that's what we're talking about, the minim. So the Koran Talmud translates it as heretics. The Art Scroll translates it as sectarians. So who are these people, these awful heretics that we let their books burn? We wouldn't even save them, even if they were written in Hebrew with God's name inside, and we wouldn't enter their house even to save our life, says Rabbi Tarfon, perhaps somewhat hyperbolically, because you always want to save life. But who are they? So these are Jews, right? Heretics are Jews. Non-Jews who have other beliefs are idolaters. And we don't believe what they believe, but we don't have these same kind of issues. A heretic is a Jew who knows what Torah is, knows what Judaism is, knows about God, and not only turns his back on God and Judaism, but seeks to undermine Judaism and the relation between the Jewish people and God. That's why they're considered to be so dangerous. And the word sectarian, it's not a word we're really used to, but it's a good word because it's people who are creating alternative sects, right? The Sadducees would fall into this group, right? They're people who are saying, oh no, you people who are the leaders of Judaism, the sages of the generation, you've got it all wrong and we know better, right? And we're going to show the people that they don't need to follow you. We're going to show them what Judaism really is. And why are they doing that? Maybe they really believe it philosophically, or maybe they're serving their own greed or their own lust for power, or who knows what. But they're undermining real Judaism with stuff that they're basically making up. Rabbi Yishmael explains, when the question is asked, but do we really, if these people, okay, they're awful, we would not help them in any way, and we oppose them in their drive to, ruin Judaism and create some other sect to attract Jews to it. But if they've written a book in Hebrew and it's got the name of God in that book, and we know, we just go so far out of our way, we will even desecrate Shabbos to save a piece, to save documents papers that have God's name in them. So why are we going to allow these books to burn? One suggestion is given, well, during the week when you have time, right, you what you might do is you would cut out the divine names from such a book and then let that book, and then you could even burn it, because now the name of God isn't even in it, so then you could burn the book. But Rabbi Yishmael says, no, we let these books burn in a fire. And the reason is a kal v'chomer, right, an a fortiori sequence, meaning kal v'chomer is a type of hermeneutical device in the Talmud where we look at one verse and say, well, if we allow this thing in an easy case or in a tough case, how much more do we allow this lesser thing in an easier case? Or vice versa, from major to minor, or from minor to major, in a way that makes logical sense. So Rabbi Yishmael's kal v'chomer on this point is, if God commanded us to erase his name for the sake of shalom bayis, right, meaning peace in the home, meaning peace between husband and wife. So he's referring, Rabbi Yishmael is referring to the procedure of the sota, right? So the sota is the wife who is suspected of committing adultery. She says she didn't do it. She was warned not to, isolate herself with a man in a place where she and the man were the only people there. She did it before. She was warned not to do that again. She does it again. She claims she didn't commit adultery, but the circumstances, are ambiguous. And so there was a procedure which spelled out in the Torah where she and her husband, accompanied by some people, will go to Jerusalem, and the priest will sort of make a recital, and then the verses of that passage are written on a piece of paper in ink, including God's name, and then that piece of paper is put in a bowl of water. And as we learned yesterday, right, in the case, I think it was Rabbi Yishmael who went to see somebody who was writing verses that shouldn't have been written down, and the guy was afraid he was going to be discovered, and he put that piece of paper with God's name in a bowl of water. And Rabbi Yishmael told him, it was bad that you wrote what you shouldn't have written, but it was worse that you let God's name be dissolved in a bowl of water. In the case of the sota, it's written out in the Torah, on purpose you let God's name be dissolved in this bowl of water, and you add a little bit of dirt from the floor of the holy temple, and then she drinks this water. It's just water with some ink that was dissolved in it, a tiny bit, and some dirt. And if she's guilty of adultery, so this mixture would kill her and be fatal. But if she's innocent, of course she'll survive, and not only that, but the husband and the wife will be reconciled. He'll realize that he was wrong. He shouldn't have suspected her. In fact, now she's going to be more fertile than she was before. They're likely to have a child come from this whole sequence of events. So the Torah, in that situation of the sota, commands that God's name be erased for the sake of shalom bayis, for the sake of peace between the wife and the husband. If so, that we erase God's name just to create peace between a husband and wife, how much more would we allow God's name to be eradicated, erased, destroyed, in this case burned, in order to create peace among the whole community? How are we creating peace? Because these heretics, with their heretical teachings and their heretical books, are sowing tremendous dissension and causing great suffering in the community as they attract, sort of vulnerable, gullible people to their teachings. So in fact, the way that this is written is kind of nice. As the Torah says, my name that was written in sanctity shall be erased in the water in the framework of the ordeal of the sota. Then here in this case, the heretics who impose jealousy and hatred and conflict between the Jewish people and their Father in heaven, all the more so is it proper to erase God's names because of them. And so therefore, these books of the heretics, we let them burn. We would not rescue them from a fire, even though God's name is written in the Holy Tongue within such books. Then we get, now that we're talking about these heretics, so we get a story of one such person who is a heretic and subscribes to a different philosophy than Judaism. Presumably he's a Jew who subscribes to this other philosophy, but he holds himself out to the community as a mensch. Not only a mensch, but he's a judge, and he says he's incorruptible, right? Because, his point is, well, you don't have to follow the Torah as these, sages and rabbis say you have to follow it. A person can be a dignified, honest, good person and follow this new philosophy that he adheres to. And, and he's really holding himself out as a person with real morals, an incorruptible and moral and ethical judge. But the sages were very suspicious of him. And so we get this beautiful little moment where Imma Shalom, who is the wife of Rabbi Eliezer, and her brother, Rabban Gamliel. Now, this little triangle, Imma Shalom and her husband Eliezer, and her brother, Rabban Gamliel, are going to figure very importantly about halfway through our journey through the Talmud in one of the most famous stories, really of all time, and certainly of the Talmud. I'm not going to tell it here, but it's when all the sages sort of gang up on Rabbi Eliezer. Eliezer is right, and he has God on his side. But all the other sages say, well, we hold differently, and the Torah is on earth and not in heaven. And when we have a conflict, we decide it by a majority vote. So you might have God on your side, but we're following God's procedure, and we've arrived at a different outcome. And the outcome of that story, the result of that confrontation is epic and painful and dramatic and amazing. So we'll come to that. I think it's in Bava Metzia 65, somewhere down there. But we're not doing that now. But these characters, Imma Shalom and Rabban Gamliel, will figure prominently in that story as well. Here, Imma Shalom and her brother, Rabban Gamliel, by the way, is the Nasi. He's the head of the Sanhedrin. He's the leader of all the sages. He's the chief rabbi of Israel, essentially, in this Mishnaic period. And they're very suspicious of this heretic who holds himself out as an incorruptible judge. So they want to prove that, he's a liar. So they bring a case to him. And in the case, I think what it is that, it's like the situation is that a wealthy man has died. And so and there's no will. He didn't dispose of his assets. So everything is supposed to go to his son, right? He has one son, but there's also a daughter. Now, according to the Torah, the inheritance goes to the son. When there is no son, it goes to the daughter. And there's a passage that says that. The passage says when there is no son, it passes to the daughter. But meaning that if there is a son, it goes to him. So they bring this case before him, probably using an intermediary, or maybe he doesn't know who they are, whatever the situation. And then she goes to see him privately and says, well, I have this beautiful and extremely valuable golden lamp. And if I was to get a ruling in my favor, I would think very favorably of the judge who gave such a ruling. And then the next day, the case comes before the judge, and he says, well, the fact is, the law has changed, and women and men inherit equally from their father. It's like he just changed the law, and he did so in response to a bribe. And then that night, Rabban Gamliel goes to this guy privately and says, that ruling is really off. And I have this Libyan donkey, very valuable. A Libyan donkey was extremely valuable. And well, if a judge was to see what the law really is and how it should be ruled and decided, perhaps the judge could get this Libyan donkey. And the next day, this incorruptible judge comes out and says, but actually the law has not changed. It has not changed since Moses, and since God gave it to Moses and Moses gave it to us. And of course, only the son inherits. So the guy was obviously exposed and revealed as a totally corrupt judge, and all his, highfalutin words about the importance of truth and justice and philosophy in his new system only went as far as the bribe that he was willing to receive and set his ethics aside. So that was a nice little moment orchestrated by Imma Shalom and her brother Rabban Gamliel. We'll see Imma Shalom a few more times. Obviously, there's many, many more male voices in the Talmud. The sages, the rabbis were men. But here and there's some wonderful female characters in the Talmud. Imma Shalom is one of them, and we will meet her again in our travels several times. Okay. Then we come to an incident having to do with the House of Abidan. So the House of Abidan is a kind of... So we've been talking about heretics, and there was this House of Abidan, which was a gathering place, not for heretics so much as it was almost like an interfaith forum for sharing wisdom. Not so dissimilar to what goes on, certainly on Facebook and lots of interesting groups. And so here, some of the sages would go to the House of Abidan and sort of, share their wisdom and learn from people from other traditions and say, well, look, what we hold is like this. This is what we see the truth as, and this can be useful to you. And we don't hold by any other religious beliefs, but we know that there's wisdom that can be learned from people from other traditions for sure, in all kinds of fields, in science and philosophy and agriculture, etc. So it was a place for sharing wisdom. Nonetheless, some of the sages were too machmir, too stringent to go there. So Rava kept getting invited by his friends, other sages who would go to the House of Abidan, but he didn't want to go there. And he didn't want to say, it's a terrible place and you shouldn't go there. He would just always make an excuse why he didn't want to go there, right? So for some of the sages, it was off limits, but for others, they would go there. And the question comes up, well, the books that are housed in that place, would we save them from a fire? And the answer is never really definitive. If it's Jewish books, there's proper Jewish books. The kind of books we would find in our houses of study, in our houses of worship. If they happen to be in there, okay, but they're going to be mixed in with all kinds of other books that we wouldn't save, so it's problematic. And that's the House of Abidan. Okay, and that is the end of what we're going to talk about regarding Mishnah number 1. Now, quickly, just to open our discussion of Mishnah number 2, and then I'll go to the comments and questions. Mishnah number 2 is also about rescuing things from a fire, and we're still talking a little bit about sacred books, but now we're going to talk about the accessories of sacred books. It's a short Mishnah. I'll read it to you. One may rescue the casing of a Torah scroll from a fire on Shabbat together with the Torah scroll, and the casing of phylacteries, meaning tefillin, along with the tefillin, even if they have money inside of them. And to where may one rescue them? Into an alley, known as a mavoi, that is closed, which, if it is surrounded on 3 sides, is considered to be a private domain by Torah law. Ben Betera says, even into an open alley. So what's the concept here? We know from the first Mishnah that if there's a fire in the synagogue and it's safe to do so, we can carry the Torah outside, right? Or from the house of study, we can carry a Torah and we can carry other holy books outside. And since we're carrying the book, of course, we can carry its casing, right? If you've ever seen the beautiful covers, Torah covers that synagogues have for their Torahs, you would take the whole Torah. You wouldn't, leave the cover inside. You take the Torah and its cover. You're trying to move as fast as you can. And you take the Torah, you take its cover, Most Torahs in a synagogue have silver crowns at the tops of the dowels that hold the scroll together. Those would go with it. Often there's a yod, like a silver pointer that hangs around the Torah that you use while you're reading. Sometimes there's like a nameplate. You take all of that. Now, what if inside the Torah cover, the casing of the Torah, especially if you think about a Sephardic Torah, because like an Ashkenaz Torah, the cover just goes over the top. It's hard to imagine what's inside of it that would stay in there. But like a Sephardic Torah is like a big, beautiful, ornate wooden box, sometimes with metal trimming. And you could easily keep something in there when the whole Torah is closed. What if there was money in there? Right? What if there was money in there? Perhaps it was the charity collection during the week and it got left inside the casing of a Torah along with the Torah. So money is muktzah on Shabbos. It has no legitimate use on Shabbos, so it's set aside. We don't touch money on Shabbos. If a pile of money was for some reason on the dining table and we wanted to have our dinner there and we needed the place where the money is sitting, so we would be very careful to move it in a very, unusual, atypical way just because we need the place. But otherwise, if we didn't need the place, we wouldn't touch the money at all. It's muktzah. You just don't touch money on Shabbos. So now, if there's money in that Torah cover, well, maybe now we can't move the Torah because of the money inside. And so this Mishna is teaching us the Torah is what's important. Whatever else happens to be in there is incidental to what you're doing here, which is saving the Torah. So if money happens to be in there, okay, so then the money gets saved from the fire too. You're not going there to save the money. You're going there to save the Torah. Now, when we get into the Gemara to try and understand this Mishnah, we get off on like a totally different question, and it takes a few paragraphs until we're like, understand why this teaching is being brought down to explain this Mishnah. The teaching has to do with Passover. At Passover, now we know Passover is the holiday where we get together with our families and friends and we have a Seder in our home. In ancient times, what was going on at Passover is that most people, everyone that could, would go to Jerusalem and they would bring the Paschal lamb, the offering of the Paschal lamb. So here, groups would register on a lamb, right? A small sheep, could also be a goat, and they would agree in advance that they were going to be the group, and then that animal would be slaughtered, and then they would be roasted, and then they would have to eat it that night, all of it, and there were certain rules about roasting it. Before you roast it, you would slaughter it in the ritual way, and some of its blood would be offered or be sprinkled on the altar in the temple courtyard. So at Passover, there were so many people. You got to imagine, it's like millions of people in Jerusalem, certainly hundreds of thousands, all coming to have these dinners, all needing to slaughter, the lamb that they're going to eat. There was just a lot of butchering going on during the run-up to Passover. Now, when would you do this? During the day of the 14th of Nisan. Passover begins at nightfall when the 15th begins. If the 14th of Nisan falls on Shabbos, can you slaughter the animal on Shabbos that you're going to eat that night? Now, we've learned that you don't do anything on Shabbos to prepare for a later holiday, right? Shabbos is the most holy, and you don't take any actions on Shabbos to prepare for something that comes after Shabbos. This is an exception. I think it's because it says so in the Torah. So if the 14th falls on Shabbos, you would slaughter the animal so that it would be ready to eat that night when it's Passover. The question that comes up is, do you do the whole job? In other words, you're going to slaughter the animal, but then what you have to do is remove its skin, take the part that's going to be offered on the altar, and then the part that you're going to eat is what's going to get roasted and cooked. There's certain parts that you can eat. So what the question is since there's parts that we don't use, right? There's the part that we eat, and then there's part that we don't eat. So if you're peeling back the skin, are you going to take all of the, after you've slaughtered the animal, are you going to flay it completely? Are you going to remove all of its skin, even though there's a part of the animal that you don't need? Or are you going to stop once you've reached the kind of, the minimum place that you need to remove that skin in order to get what you need so you can prepare for Passover? So in other words, once you've got permission to do something you normally wouldn't do on Shabbos, which is to slaughter and to flay the animal, do you stop when you've done enough to just accomplish what you need, or do you complete the flaying, right? In other words, you've got permission to remove the Torah, but maybe you shouldn't remove the money. Maybe even though the money's in that casing, you should open it up, remove the money, which is muktzah, and then just take the Torah, which you're saving from the fire. That's the question, and the halacha comes out that just as we remove the money along with the Torah, it's the Torah we're removing, the money that may happen to be in there is incidental. Likewise, we're slaughtering the animal for Passover. We've been allowed to, we have a permit to do that, as it were, on Shabbos. And once we've got that permit, we just do the job completely. We flay the animal completely. We don't try to stop at that kind of minimum amount of skin removal so that we could get what we need from the Paschal lamb. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let's check the questions and comments. John Shore says, a thought. When we study together in one room, the Shekhinah resides with us in that particular place. When we study Talmud over the internet, aren't we bringing the Shekhinah to all those places? How much holier thanks to you and Nina. Oh, John, that's such a sweet thing to say. And I like it. I mean, we know it's a teaching that the divine presence rests on people who are studying Torah together. That's what we're doing. We're studying Torah together. What does it mean that we're doing it virtually? This is something the sages never could have imagined. But there is definitely holiness in this virtual space between us. And since we're all in these different countries and even continents, we're really making a net, right? Like a web, literally a web of holiness that is reaching out across states, countries, continents. What a beautiful thought, John. Sharon Frant Brooks says, a friend of mine was once concerned about the literature of Jehovah's Witnesses as it contains the Tetragrammaton, that's the four-letter name of God. Does it need to go to a Geniza? Well, according to what we just learned, no. If a name of God is written in a place that is not a Jewish holy book, then we don't concern ourselves with it. That's just, it's either idolatrous or heretical, depending on the situation. Bill Eldridge, so all of this leads to a delicate question. Do Christians and Muslims count as heretics under this schema, and what does that imply for their holy books in a fire? Okay, Bill, you went there. And the answer is, heretics does not refer to Christians, right? At the time of the Talmud, this was very early in the history of Christianity, very early, right? This is, right around the birth of it, a little later. So the Christian movement was still very small. When there were Jews becoming Christians, they were considered heretics. But as the Christian religion became larger, and it was mostly composed of Gentiles, of non-Jews, so then it was just considered another religion. There were people who were just doing something different, not heretics. Heretics really refers to Jews that are trying to undermine Judaism and the relationship between the Jewish people and God. Brandon Christian Sullivan, were the Sadducees a heretical sect since they denied the oral law and only held to the Torah, not the prophets or the writings? Yes, the Sadducees were considered heretics. Absolutely. Bill Eldridge, Libyan donkeys, the Ferrari of donkeys. Just so. And Brian of Bloomfield says, so is it ever permissible to burn heretical books with Hashem's name on purpose? I'm guessing, hoping not, but it seems one might make that jump. And the answer is no. No, we don't burn books, especially if it has God's name in it. We would allow them to degrade. We might even leave them outside where they'll degrade more rapidly if such books come into our possession and we need to do something with them. So since God's name is written in them, we wouldn't flat out destroy the books. Really what we've been talking about here is what we save from a fire. And in the case of heretical books, we wouldn't even save them from a fire on a weekday. We wouldn't save them from flooding. We wouldn't save them from a landslide or an earthquake. But we wouldn't go out of our way to destroy them either if they have God's name in it. Okay. That is what I've got for us today. Some delicate matters were touched upon. If this stuff is, if it really makes you curious, there's a few passages in today's daf that we didn't discuss. There wasn't time. You might check it out. Tomorrow, with page 117, with God's help, we'll get more into that basic principle, getting away from sacred works and our responsibility towards sacred works, and just the practical, like there's a fire, I'd like to save my money, I'd like to save my clothes, I'd like to save my kitchen things, I'd like to stop the fire before it destroys my house. I mean, these are the real questions that come up much more often for people, and we're going to get into that discussion tomorrow. One last comment from Lynn Job. When we are live online here, we are not alone. It's such a blessing to be connected during learning to amplify the mitzvah of learning. We have turned the pandemic blow into a blessed new way for the sake of heaven. What a lovely thought, Lynn. All the best to you, my holy brothers and sisters, and God willing, we'll be together again.